Welcome to Teaching with Heart. Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the podcast. My name is Danielle Flores. I'm a lifelong learner, an early childhood educator, a student, and a proud pet parent. I spent the past 5 years teaching pre-kindergarten, and every day I'm reminded of just how powerful early education can be. It's not just where students learn their letters and numbers, it's where they start learning who they are and who can they become. Today, I want to share my story, not just as a teacher, but as a person and as a curricular decision maker. I'll talk about my identity and my values and experiences that help shape my teaching practices and how those connect with larger educational frameworks at the local, state, and national, even global level. I'll also explore the curriculum ideologies that grounded my work, how those ideologies show up in my classroom, and how they align with the key thinkers in curriculum theory. Have you ever had a teacher who made you feel small, like you didn't belong? I have, and it changed me in my perspective of academics. But I've also had teachers who made me feel like I mattered, that I was capable, and that I was seen. Those experiences are why I teach the way I do today, and why I believe so deeply in inclusive, identity affirming curriculum. To share a little bit about me, I was born in a small town called Midland, Texas, and raised in San Antonio most of my life. I am a female Hispanic, and my culture is a huge part of who I am. Our traditions, like making tamales during the holidays or baking crescent cookies as a family, instilled in me a love of togetherness, storytelling, cultural pride, and community. These aren't just a warm memories, they've become more of core principles in my teaching philosophy: connection, shared knowledge, and honoring lived experiences. As a student, I struggled especially with math concepts. I often felt academically left behind in school. These formative experiences left me with a strong sense of what education should be like. Not a place where students fall through the cracks, but a place where every child's strengths are noticed, nurtured, and celebrated. As I've grown in my career, I've become to understand who I am: a Hispanic woman, a lifelong educator and student, and these shaped me both with struggles and resilience. It's deeply intertwined in how I teach and what I value in curriculum and instruction. At the heart of my teaching is a simple belief: education should be inclusive, affirming, and responsive. It is shaped by a critical and reconceptualist curriculum theory that education should be inclusive, affirming, and liberatory. For me, education isn't just a standardized plan handed down from above. It's a lived experience we co create with our students. This stance is both deeply personal and deeply political. I'm grounded in social reconstructionist and learner centered ideologies, and I see that education is a practice of freedom, care, and liberation. Drawing from inspiration from thinkers like Paulo Freire, Nell Noddings, and Bell Hooks, I believe that every student deserves a curriculum that reflects who they are, values their voice, and empowers them to shape a more just and compassionate world. Drawing on Gloria Ladson-Billings' theory of culturally relevant pedagogy, I believe that culture isn't an add-on to curriculum, it's foundational. My students' cultural assets aren't secondary, they're central to how and what we learn. I actively reject the dominant white-centered narrative as a default. In my classroom, this belief shows up in very real ways. Locally at my district, I co create lessons that reflect the rich linguistic and cultural diversity of our community. Nationally, this work is part of a broader push against deficit thinking, something deeply embedded in many curricula standardizations. I'm aligning with what Michael Apple describes as challenging the official knowledge. So, the kind of knowledge that traditional schooling tends to privilege by instead of placing students' voice at the center. This approach, also deeply informed by the history of education for Mexican American students, curriculum was once a tool of assimilation. As we have read in the Curriculum Foundations reader, the section about Mexican Americans, as well as other marginalized groups, in a sense of curriculum was used to erase language or culture. Today, I use this tool of affirmation. Gloria Ladson Billings taught me that honoring students' identity isn't just a nice to have, it's essential. Geneva Gay reminds us that culturally responsive teaching means using students' cultural knowledge, prior experiences, and ways of expressing themselves to make learning more effective and meaningful. In practice, this means incorporating books, music, and family stories that reflect students' lives. I use Spanish sometimes, not only as a part of my own identity, but to validate and uplift the linguistic heritage of many students that are in my classroom. This approach directly challenges dominant narratives, what James Banks refers to as the canon of multicultural education. It raises important questions such as who gets centered, who gets silenced by making cultural a central part of the curriculum. I aim to disrupt the marginalization of the non dominant groups and instead foster more inclusive, affirming learning spaces. Ultimately, scholars like Latson Billings, Banks, and Apple have helped me see how curriculum has long reinforced white, Eurocentric values. By designing curriculum that's rooted in local while also connected in a national conversation on equity, I see myself contributing to the larger movement of curriculum justice, one that's more inclusive and relevant and transformative. At the state and district level, my teaching is grounded in principles of universal design for learning, UDL, which is a framework supported by federal policies through IDEA, so Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, a federal law that ensures students with disabilities have access to free and appropriate public education, as well as backed by CAS, so a Center for Applied Special Technology. It's a nonprofit organization that is one of the global leaders of inclusive education, developer of Universal Design for Learning framework. So CAS mission is to transform education to be more inclusive and accessible for all learners, especially those with disabilities. So UDL aligns closely with my belief that equity begins with access. So as a teacher in a Title I school, I see firsthand how rigid pacing guides and standardized assessments can be marginalizing for those neurodiverse learners, English learners, and students who thrive through alternative modalities. That's why UDL is central to my curriculum approach. It helps me create multiple pathways for engagement, representation, and expression to ensure that students aren't forced to fit into one size fits all type of model. I can offer content in various formats, whether that's visual, auditory, tactile, and provide different ways for students to engage with materials and show what they know. These principles also echo Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, where students succeed when given the right scaffolds. Just like Elliot Eisner's view of curriculum should nurture multiple forms of intelligence, not just those who show up on test scores. While my approach doesn't always align perfectly with district pacing expectations, I navigate that tension intentionally. I draw from Tomlinson's theory of differentiated instruction and adapt instruction in ways that affirm both my students' identities and their learning needs. I've learned how to meet district goals without reducing my students to these data points, seeing UDL not just as a strategy, but as a form of advocacy. Ultimately, I use UDL to work within state frameworks while reshaping them to better serve my students. For me, it's about thinking and making sure that the curriculum serves the students and the children, not the other way around. Globally, my teaching is inspired by educators like Paulo Freire and Nell Noddings, who saw education as practice rooted in both freedom and care. Paulo Freire talked about this in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, saying how education should be dialogical. It should be rooted in real life and tied to actions. In my classroom, project-based learning isn't just a strategy. It is more of a philosophical commitment to students' agency, inquiry, and real-world relevancy. I design projects around big questions connecting to justice, community, and in the environment. For example, a simple unit on community helpers evolved into student-led inquiries, interviews, and handwritten thank you cards to these local workers. The project became an act of appreciation, but also a lesson in civic engagement, the kind of participatory learning Fiore called praxis. So, reflection of action working together for transformation. I lean on project based learning and real life inquiry to cultivate curiosity and connection in the classroom content to students' lives. This aligns with the principles of backward design from Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe, Understanding by Design, starting with meaningful outcomes and designing instruction to support deep, lasting understanding. These projects also connect local learning to global themes like sustainability, equity, and citizenship, echoing international education goals and what Bell Hooks called engaged pedagogy. It's about inviting students to bring their full selves to the classroom and empowering them to see learning as something that matters beyond the school walls. My curriculum stance isn't just something I believe in, it's something I live out every day through how I plan, how I teach, and advocate. At the classroom level, it means resisting a one size fits all approach and instead prioritizing identity affirming content, my students' voice, and multiple ways for learners to express what they know. At the school level, it means speaking up during a PLC, so a professional learning community, where we have lesson plans and discuss our grade level materials. And I noticed that our materials, sometimes it seems like things are erased or misrepresented for other communities or marginalized groups. So I actively share resources and co-plan lessons that can be more reflective of our students' cultures, languages, and what their learning needs are. At a district level, I advocate for inclusive assessments, multilingual materials, and curriculums that can be at the center. I want to make sure that all students, not just those who, I guess you could say, fit the mold, are seen and supported and challenged. And at a broader level, I recognize my role as an education system that has historically marginalized certain identities. I align myself with educators around the world who are reimagining curriculum, not as a neutral document, but as a powerful tool for justice and liberation. As I reflect on my curriculum personality, I see my work as rooted in multiple ideologies. I draw from a social reconstructionist tradition, so through scholars like Michael Apple and Paulo Freire, to center justice, equity, and transformation. I also feel I align with learner-centered theorists such as Nell Noddings and Lev Vygotsky, who remind us to honor students' voice, relationships, and developmental needs. I don't see curriculum as a fixed list of standards or a script that we should be following. Instead, I believe it's a dynamic conversation between the teacher, the students, and their cultures and the world around them. An idea that's inspired by William Pinner's work. To me, curriculum isn't neutral, it's personal, it's political, and it's been shaped by lived experiences. You know, my own journey as a woman, a Latina, and an educator has taught me what it feels like to be overlooked, underestimated, and at times even uplifted. So that's why I work with making sure my students have these experiences that are opposite. So to feel seen, to feel heard, and empowered in the classroom. I believe that curriculum should be students making sense of themselves and the world around them. It should be a reflection and reflect their identities and give them tools to question and to change the system of injustice. As Elliot Eisner reminds us, there are many approaches to curriculum. Some are centered content mastery, others are value personal growth or critical awareness. My stance lives in the intersection of social reconstruction and learner-centered views, where learning is not only about knowledge, but also about liberation. So if you are listening as a fellow educator, I invite you to ask yourself a few questions. What is your curriculum ideology? How do your identities shape your teaching? And how can you use your personality to create curriculum that doesn't just teach content, but builds our humanity? Thanks so much for spending this time with me today. I hope my story resonates with you, inspires you, or simply just reminds you that teaching with the heart is one of the most powerful things that we can do as educators. I'm Danielle Flores, and this has been Teaching with Heart. Until next time, stay kind, stay open, and keep showing up for your students and for yourself. Bye.